Good afternoon, everybody. I am now presenting a module on research methodology in sociology, which is numbered as RMS8. It is a part of the program of UGC E-Pathshala. I am Sri Shubhendra Bhomik from the district of Purulia of West Bengal. I am teaching in the university which is called Shidho Kanha Biswa University in the Department of Sociology in the capacity of an assistant professor. The module's name, which I have written as a content writer, is the problem of objectivity and value neutrality. It basically contains the problems or the troubles that a researcher finds himself or herself in when he or she is engaged in social research. In the context of his or her dealing with facts in the grounds while keeping himself or herself, actually while expecting to keep himself or herself detached from the people and their peoples and the people's subjectivity, to be very precise, which is difficult because being a human being, the social researcher cannot untie himself or herself from the other people, from the other beings who are exactly or very much like her or him. And the problem of objectivity and value neutrality, to my mind, are actually two aspects of the same problem or the same issue, which is the issue of detachment. Now, we will try to focus on this module on these two things, but we will not argue that these are very sacrosanct things, in the sense that being social researchers and having the people as their subject and object at the same time, we, the social researchers, must be very careful and must be very, must be very caring, in the sense that we are not dealing with inanimate bodies, we are not dealing with objects like other material objects, but we are dealing with concrete human beings. This is important to remember, and we will try to harp on this particular dimension of the problem. We will see how in sociology and along with other social sciences, this problem of objectivity has been visited by scholars like Max Weber, Emil Durkheim, or who is not a sociologist actually, but who people would claim that perhaps a very great sociologist, Karl Marx. We will visit them and we will see what do they feel about or around this particular problem or issue. This module is meant for developing some ideas regarding objectivity in various senses of the term. The questions of values in social research are closely connected with objectivity too, hence the two will be given due importance in this module. However, attempts are made to underscore the fact that achievement of objectivity and value neutrality are neither easy nor always desirable for the sociologists. Now, let me submit what we are trying to learn in this module. Since sociology has the reputation of a science, it is imperative on its practitioners to remain personally detached from their subject matter. Thus, objectivity and value neutrality are the two virtues that sociology can never ignore. However, when the researchers go into their field and meet flesh and blood human beings, they understand how much different their objects are, and then they realize that the scientific virtues of objectivity and neutrality are to be combined with another set of virtues, empathy and criticism. Our module is a modest attempt to help appreciate the above qualities also on the part of the social researcher. To begin with, what is objectivity? Whenever you look at something, what actually happens is bringing together of two parties, one who looks and the other who is looked at. The same can be said in case of hearing, smelling, tasting, touching and even feeling for or thinking about the thing one is concerned about. First party is the subject and the second the object, and this relationship is famously known as the subject-object relationship. However, the matters take on quite complex shape as we move on to the ideas of objectivity and subjectivity instead of object and subject. As Gokroger writes in an entry on history of objectivity in the Encyclopedia of the Social and Behavioral Sciences, objectivity stands in contrast to subjectivity. An objective account is one which attempts to capture the nature of the object studied in a way that does not depend on any features of the particular subject who studies it. An objective account is, in this sense, impartial, one which could ideally be accepted by any subject. Objectivity, however, can mean several things. E. Valentine Daniel maintains in the Macmillan Reference International Encyclopedia of the Social Sciences, I quote, "Objectivity in the sciences, especially the social sciences, is paired implicitly or explicitly with its opposite, subjectivity. Less obvious yet commonplace pairings with the term objectivity are partiality, relativity and the arbitrary." Unquote. We would be concerned here firstly with the notion of objectivity as opposed to subjectivity, and secondly, in a more specific sense, with the notion which refers to the mechanisms of protecting the scientist from being partial. The latter sense is more or less similar to value neutrality, for the issue of partiality centers around value preference. For our convenience, we will call it neutrality. Objectivity, our first issue, is more complicated and perhaps relatively more difficult to be attained by the researcher. We cannot but remain tied to our subjectivity, particularly while dealing with someone having subjectivity like us. In these cases, to put it bluntly, it is human beings studying human beings. With the self-same terms on the two sides of the statement, it becomes an identity. We can surmise the right hand of the identity is not something that can be exhaustively defined. With human beings, it will vary via consciousness, and consciousness having agency always slips before being defined. Moreover, it will change reflexively, for the studied human being is exposed to the conclusions that the analyst has already reached. Neutrality is another difficult thing to achieve on the part of the social scientists, more or less for similar reasons. Moreover, how can the analysts remain indifferent to the welfare of fellow human beings? However, sometimes in some arenas other than science, one can be fairly objective but neutral. Suppose the behavior of the Nazi perpetrators in the infamous concentration camps. They acted on the basis of perfect calculability and objectivity insofar as their carefully chosen means are concerned, literally taking the human beings as objects to be perished in the most efficient manner. But had they been neutral by any standard, their aims are dictated by their interests alone. Objectivity in the social sciences has thrived on some metaphorical sense of the word object. For in the realm of culture, there is hardly an object to consider, that is, in its chief material sense, anything that is visible or tangible and is relatively stable in form. I quoted from Random House Webster Unabridged Dictionary. The issue of objectivity is philosophical and meta-theoretical in that it lies at the background and foreground of the domain of science at large. But here we are concerned with the problem in maintaining objectivity in sociology, which in its turn is closely connected with the problem of objectivity in any social and human science. However, since objectivity or detachment is an abstract idea, we may have a concrete illustration from everyday life. This example will also give some clues to understand our concern with neutrality. Our two concerns, objectivity and value neutrality, may now be revised as follows. First, a requisite distance from the investigator's self, and the other, disinterestedness in the moral or affective sense. We can see that they are quite close, therefore at certain times we may consider them as two aspects of what is broadly the same concern for detachment. The first aspect is intellectual and epistemological, while the second is related to emotion and to ethical and political considerations. Now let us have the illustration from the everyday life. Suppose one wants to study the very chair she is now sitting upon. in order to observe the whole of the chair, she better come down and then watch it from a distance. However, if she is short-sighted or colorblind, and worse, if she is not aware of her ocular handicaps, then she may have a compromised vision of the chair. Therefore, some other persons should observe it, and then, in order to arrive at a uniform visual image of the chair, they all sit together subsequently and place their individual observations on the table. If some considerable disagreement occurs, they would perhaps decide to go to an expert, who the expert may not depend on her sense data alone and would get herself measuring tapes, cameras, etc. Then, let us come to the second aspect of detachment, disinterestedness. When one is distanced enough, then only she could be interested in the shape and look of the chair, not because she loves or hates it, but because she is curious about it. If, however, the chair belonged to her beloved but now deceased grandfather, who was always very fond of this chair, and now if she finds that her friends are trying to belittle its value, which annoys and hurts her, then we may conclude that the chair has trespassed into her very self to a certain extent, and she is no longer emotionally disinterested. Let us come to objectivity and sociology proper. In case of physical sciences dealing with non-living things, this detachment is the easiest thing to achieve. And as for the non-human life sciences, we can maintain our objectivity with little additional caution. But when we deal with the human sciences, we are always already deeply implicated. However, even among them, the science of medicine is less problematic than any science that engages with conscious as well as social human beings. For example, anthropology, sociology, etc. In these latter cases, the extent of difficulty is maximum or substantial at least. How can we detach ourselves from our consciousness of thinking mind? At the level of physiology too, I am quite unable to separate myself from my pain unless I have already been anesthetized. Nevertheless, I can at least separate my mind from this pathology and bring myself to a doctor. But when I feel mentally deranged, I generally cannot realize what is wrong with me. With their minds detached from my own, my friends and kin can detect my trouble. However, it is simpler for those who are less involved with me, for often familiarity begets blindness. On the other hand, closeness might be helpful too in noticing the malady. Later, we will see that this argument for closeness to the object of study is now being increasingly felt in the social sciences. In order to measure something, we often need to come close to it. Distance is not the fundamental problem, but the observer's involvement is, or so it seems. Actually, the issue of involvement is more complicated for a social scientist. It is boon and curse simultaneously. In order to be objective, however, we generally take recourse to the various measures of validity and reliability that ask whether I am measuring the right thing or not. That is the issue of validity, provided that I am now measuring the right thing anyway, whether I am not particularly handicapped through my partial or myopic or simply inefficient and inconsistent vision. That is the question of reliability. However, those who feel responsibility toward others will be unhappy with someone's impaired condition and try to intervene with a positive frame of mind. And this is involvement indeed. In the human sciences, it is difficult to say a clear no to this kind of involvement because, firstly, we need to be responsible to our subject, which is subjectivity, as do the researchers themselves. And secondly, our knowledge would be seriously compromised without some involvement with the thinking people who are our object of knowledge, but often called subjects too. At this juncture, let us look at a multiplicity of approaches that have much to do with these issues of objectivity and value neutrality. We will now resort to a schema to understand them. Adapting from W. L. Newman's terms, we may propose A. Positivism of Comte, J. S. Mill, Durkheim, Persons and others. B. Interpretivism associated with Weber, Zimmel, Schutz, Barger and Lachmann, Garfinkel and others. And C. Critical approaches of Marx, Frankfurt School, critical theorists, feminist theorists and others. Positivism is a philosophy of science which believes that a uniform natural scientific approach is applicable for all the realms and levels of reality, natural and social, and after having conceded the core value that any science has got the capacity to ensure a very broad-based kind of human welfare, it eschews any more value to allow unauthorized inroads into the scientific enterprise. Interpretivism or hermeneutics rejects the idea that such a singular natural scientific approach is either possible or desirable, for in a socio-cultural context, one of the most important things is subjective meaning that cannot be understood without empathy. The votaries of this approach also enjoin us to be less dispassionate, since authentic knowledge would remain incomplete without becoming somewhat involved with the studied object. We mean the people's behavior. Hence, even if they speak of passion, their interest is actually intellectual, not moral as such. However, neutrality is important for most of them, as science is a vocation and it cannot allow partisanship. With Marxists, critical theorists and feminists, etc., neutrality is another name for accepting the ruling ideology at face value, which should have been criticized both as inauthentic and irresponsible. They are generally less concerned with objectivity independently of the issue of neutrality. Let us elaborate the above schema. Positivism, at least in its early stage, acted as a doctrine professing to lead gradually toward an advanced, hence preferred way of life. Positivism consists in inculcating in social scientists a positive, that is, mature and resolute state of mind, and following the time-tested natural science methods, observation, comparison, and experimentation in the realm of social phenomena. Durkheim, following Kant, did not forego the affirmative role of science, including sociology. However, he advocated astuteness to gain certainty about the findings before going for any policy intervention. In matters of arriving at objective findings and vindicating the positivist approach in sociology, Durkheim had a very detailed protocol elaborated in the rules of sociological method. First, he enjoins us to treat social facts as things, that is, as objects. Then he argues that we are required to perceive them through quantitative dimensions like rates of suicide or exterior aspects like punishments in order to come to grips with the level of integration or morality of a society respectively. Next, the social facts must be outside or external to the individuals and must constrain them in the form of coercion. Things coerce someone from outside, and it is important for us to note that they are generally incongruent with the subjectively held wishes and ideas. Then, what is interpretivism? Alan Bryman, in this book, The Social Research Methods, divided the various research methods into two big camps, quantitative and qualitative. His schema tells us that the researchers and the research methods can be divided by their philosophical orientations, namely ontological as well as epistemological. Those who believe that the social reality is ontologically objective are positivist in their epistemological concern, and they would prefer quantitative methods. On the other hand, the constructionist ontology would spawn the epistemological outlook of interpretivism, and its followers would pursue qualitative methods of inquiry. The whole arena of hermeneutics and phenomenology that emphasize on subjective meanings and subjective experience, respectively, belong to the latter paradigm. Their common assumptions are society is a mental construction and its reality has to be searched within the meaningful actions of the individuals. Sometimes the hermeneutic approach rummages meanings through discourse analysis too, and thereby leaves some space for discursive structures to appear that might constrain the individuals. By discourse analysis we mean forms of textual analysis. The texts like Mahabharata, the Bible, etc., are generally characterized by frozen forms of meaning, and the purpose of analysis is to exhibit their structures and sometimes relate them to the extant social practices. Phenomenology, on the other hand, banks on the experiences that can be extremely fluid, multiple, and too much transient to get frozen like the discourses. Max Weber proposed detailed and interconnected methods of attaining objectivity in sociological research, having approximated the individual's personalized meanings through Verstehen or interpretative understanding. The investigator subsequently attempts at somewhat impersonalized explanation. Interpretative understanding is a rigorously planned strategy to place the researchers in the position of their subjects to interpret the subjective meanings imputed by the individuals themselves. Once a researcher understands that to touch an elderly person's feet has a religious value for a devout Hindu, she would explain this behavior simply by looking at the extent of regularity of the practice. How far the subjective meanings are shared and fair as objectively given is a question remains to be asked, for very few things are rooted in our commonly held physiological drives and reflexes. How do we read each other's mind? Be that of my neighbor or of my informant remains a puzzle. Alfred Schutz would raise this question and direct the sociologists to look into the way intersubjectivity is made possible through assuming that people are sharing one another's life worlds uncritically. The typifications are actually people's believed in approximations of the things around them, which are comparable to Weber's inferential conceptual tool, ideal types. Ideal types were actually proposed to see whether and how sociology could make causal analysis on fairly objective grounds. Now we may turn to the third approach, that is the critical one. The tradition of criticism goes back to Kant, Hegel, and Marx. The Frankfurt School theorists like Horkheimer, Adorno, or Marcuse were also influenced by Nietzsche, Freud, and Weber, and therefore their critical approach was not simple-minded. However, for other thinkers like Lukács and Gramsci, Marx was perhaps the most important figure. For Karl Marx, one's ideas are closely associated with his class location, which the person realizes chiefly through his involvement in the productive practices that he finds himself carrying out as a member of his class. Marx, the philosopher of historical materialism, does not propose to stay neutral or impartial, for one cannot remain unentangled in the presence of a ruling or some other kinds of ideologies. And Marx had famously opined, philosophers have described the world in many ways, time has come to change it. On the other hand, he claimed to have found certain general natural science law-like principles of social dynamism, and the dynamism will have consequences for the acts of people who, being organized on the basis of their objectively determined class position, must have to push the wheel of social progress. If that progress means revolution, then it will have to wait for the class consciousness to grow among the progressive class. We are rather through the back door brought back to the issue of subjectivity, for revolutionary praxis is based in class consciousness. Marx took science almost for granted, and to my mind did not interrogate much as to how a science of society could be made possible, as did Weber and Durkheim. However, having pledged to build a rigorous, if not mechanical, natural science of society that would necessarily follow historical materialistic principles, he went on to analyze the capitalist economy and society in every historical detail that made allowances for sophisticated and nuanced reading. Now, more on sociology and objectivity. The positivists tried hard to sell their empiricist model to the sociologists and other social scientists since the days of Auguste Comte and J.S. Mill. They were particularly successful with economics and psychology, but only partially with political science, anthropology, and sociology. Since these latter sciences deal more with qualitative than quantitative data, the employment of various measures, statistics, and mathematics are less common. However, this natural lack of mathematical precision should not pose irresolvable difficulty in matters relating to objectivity. There are always attempts to explore some kind of objectivity in variegated manners, conventional or not. According to Durkheim, comparative sociology is not an special branch of sociology, but sociology itself. It is through this method that a general understanding of the social would be possible at the global level, with varieties of standpoints meeting one another in a continuous fashion. With this tool of comparison, the biases pertaining to the specificity of standpoints could be cancelled out. With comparisons between whole societies or between certain aspects of different societies, similarities and differences between social forms get distilled. This is indeed a service toward more objective understanding of human social life. Professor Anthony Giddens proposed the idea of public character of sociology. He says in his undergraduate textbook, Sociology, I quote, "Sociologists strive to be detached in their research and theoretical thinking, trying to study the social world in an open-minded way. But nobody is completely open-minded on all topics. Here the public character of the discipline is of major importance, because findings and reports of research are available for scrutiny, published in articles, monographs or books. Others can check the conclusions." Unquote. Nowadays, the field workers themselves are required to state their own field experiences and standpoints related to their race, gender, class, as well as that of their being an observers to their subjects. All these help to increase the level of objectivity, for anybody who likes to revisit the data would be benefited by these declarations. Thus, the new methods to gain objectivity are actually drawing the sociologists nearer to their relationship with their subjects, instead of distancing them from the latter. However, this bringing the sociologist and our informants closer to each other is not for the purpose of achieving the rigor of objectivity only, but as feminists and other critical thinkers always state, with human beings studying human beings, it is not fair to treat them as mere objects. Sociologists cannot just subject them to dispassionate observation, but it is justice that demands that they should honor their subjects' own subjectivity. Professor Andre Bethe stressed on treating objectivity as fairness, since sociologists cannot and should not avoid taking up contentious issues where her own standpoint is involving enough to, she has few recourse to remain objective other than through fairness. Now, let us read from Bethe's Religion as a Subject for Sociology. I quote, "In dealing with human beings, we have to be governed by considerations not merely of intellectual rigor, but also of fairness. It is this need for fairness in presenting or taking into account different points of view that gives to social inquiry its distinctive character. The viewpoint of the observer must be constantly matched with that of the actor. The sociologist can at best bring these various points of view into the open and can be candid about his own values." Unquote. By way of conclusion, we may say that this problem of objectivity and value neutrality is quite an immense problem for the sociologists, not unlike many other social scientists. Sociology in particular is in a quite troubling position in this regard, as we have already mentioned. Now, we have surveyed many important sociologists like Weber and Durkheim or Marx, who is actually a social philosopher. We have mentioned also Alfred Schultz, mentioned some other philosophical and sociological schools which have got something to do with this objectivity and value neutrality. Now, what I can see from all these things that the three approaches that we mentioned, adapting from Newman, positivism, interpretivism, and critical approach. Among them, positivism has almost been bade a goodbye, though since sociology claims to be a science, I don't think positivism can be finally wished away totally and lock, stock and barrel. However, positivism has been sidelined considerably by critical approach and also by interpretivism. With the harping of meaning part, the interpretivists have sidelined positivism, but since interpretivists are not actually directly avoiding or directly not dealing with the question of value, for they too want to have a quantum of scientificity in their work. They are criticized by critical approach takers too. Therefore, while interpretivism was radical enough to question the scientism of positivism, while they were interested in subjectively held positions, interpretivists somewhat lacked the penetration of the critical theorists, which were primarily based in social criticism. However, to conclude, we can say that since these debates are basically methodological and philosophical, we can't say a last word on them. Thank you very much.